Killer Innovations Podcast for Sunday, July 3rd, 2005, show number 17, coming to you from Sacramento, California. Hello, this is Phil McKinney, and welcome to this week's podcast. Based on the number of downloads we're getting on the podcast, a number of you will be new listeners this week. Needless to say, the Apple iTunes support for podcast has generated a significant jump or increase in the number of listeners for a number of the podcasts, and I'm proud to say Killer Innovations is listed on iTunes. So if you have iTunes and you think that might be easier, you can now just go over to iTunes and subscribe to the podcast under the iTunes store, and it will automatically be loaded down into your iTunes player. Before we get started, I need to go ahead and give the normal standard disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and mine alone, and do not necessarily reflect those of my past, current, or future employers. First of all, I want to extend my appreciation to the people who've been sending me emails, feedback on the podcast. That is extremely helpful. Have gotten a number of great ideas for upcoming podcast shows, inquiries about going into more detail on things covered in the past, along with new subjects that are along the lines of the theme of the podcast, which is basically trying to share with you what's happening in research in the area of innovation, creativity, idea generation, and hopefully give you skills and tricks and tools in order to be able to apply that to your business. So again, thanks for that feedback and keep it coming. Also, this being the first podcast in the month of July, as I've announced in some of the previous podcasts, we are changing the ID3 tags that are contained in the MP3 files that you download. So right now, while you're listening, look down at your MP3 player. You're going to notice that the tags or the text information that appears on the display is different than the previous podcasts. One is now it will display properly sorted order in your playlist by date. So hopefully that'll make it much easier for those of you listening to the podcast in order or going back and downloading previous versions to be able to see that by date. Now, I will tell you that this July podcast will be the only one that has the new ID3 tag so far. I'm going to wait for feedback before I go back and modify all the previous 16 shows and update the ID3 tag. So this is an experiment. Give me some feedback. Do you like it? Are there things that don't work well on your specific MP3 player to make it easier for you to sort, play the shows in order, be able to go find a specific show, etc. So give me feedback, and then we'll modify all the previous shows to match the new ID3 tags. So again, sort by date. The track number now contained in the MP3 will equal the show number. So track 1 will be show 1, track 16 will be show 16, and in this case, today's show, it will be track number 17. And we've also shortened up the title so that in the, particularly on the iPod, where you only have, 15 or 16 characters on the display, you'll have enough information on that display to be able to know which of the Killer Innovation shows or podcasts that you're listening to. So again, take a look at your MP3 player right now, and then hop on your email, drop me an email message at podcast@killerinnovations.com, and let me know how you like that. In this week's show, we're going to go back to kind of the previous format of the show that we have done. Last week, we instead of the Week Signals segment 2 of the show, shared with you kind of an application story. Very, very positive feedback on that. We're going to weave that in as part of the format for the podcast going forward, but also a lot of comments on people who both like the story but also like the Week Signals segment. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to keep to a schedule of every other show. So every other show will have a weak signals segment, and every other show will have a what I would call an application of innovation, a story about major companies or major products, major technologies, and how they're applying the innovation process to come up with those ideas and what the results were. So you can get a better perspective on the actual application. So, given that we did the Black & Decker story in last week's show, this week we are going to go back to the weak signals. So, today we're going to have the main three segments. The first segment, segment 1 on the overall innovation process, is about storytelling and using stories to convey or convince people about your ideas, about your innovations, in order to be able to build a consensus and to be able to draw people into your inner circle as you're working on developing your breakthrough ideas. Next, we're going to talk about weak signals, and in this case, we're going to talk about innovation and the kinds of innovation that you get from different generations of employees or different generation of customers that potentially could lead you into weak signals. And then this week is we're also going to have our killer question of the week. So, first up, let's talk about the whole process or the challenge of creativity and innovation. When you've come up with a very creative idea, how do you convince your management team, the executive team within your organization, even team members, or in some cases even family members, to try to get on board to what your idea is, and how to convince them that what you're working on or what you have conceived has viability and potentially could be something extremely exciting. Now, in my job, I get a lot of small companies or individual inventors trying to present their technologies or present their concepts in order for potential acquisition, looking for investment, looking to partner, whatever the case might be. The problem is, though, is if an inventor or an innovator or a small company, if they can't really convey the value that they've got in a relatively short period of time, just given the sheer number of companies that we look at on a day-by-day basis, it becomes almost impossible. I kind of a firm believer of the Guy Kawasaki formula for presentation, which is no more than 10 slides and nothing smaller than 30-point font. If you can't tell your story, if you can't convince your audience of the value that you have in less than 10 slides and nothing less than 30-point font, then you really haven't thought enough about the story or the value that you bring to the market. So with that in mind, one of the key tools that you have to have when convincing management teams, team members, even family members who come from a variety of backgrounds, they come with a variety of skill sets, technical depth and knowledge, educational backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. The best way in order to convince them of what the value is in your idea is in telling stories. Now, there's a great book that I picked up, and I'm not even sure how long ago I picked up the book, and it's called The Springboard. And it's basically written, it's a book about how do you construct stories in order to ignite the passion of an organization. It's written by Stephen Denning, who is the program director at the World Bank. And basically, Stephen came up with this process of crafting stories in order to be shared, almost like living history of an organization, in order to convey and share knowledge within the World Bank. Now, when I read the book, I've kind of taken the context of that book and shifted it slightly in looking at how do you take stories and can you construct stories that ignite the passion of your listeners around your idea, where they can place themselves into that story and see what the future can become if your idea, technology, innovation, approach is adopted. So the real challenge on storytelling, though, is that you have to be conscious of what is in the context and content of the story. And some of the things that Stephen Denning has identified in the Springboard approach, and also just from lessons learned in my own case of doing a lot of public speaking and trying to do a lot of convincing audiences around either the products or the strategies or a vision for an industry or whatever the case might be. There's a couple of things that I've learned over the years about constructing these kinds of stories. One is around plausibility. Um, you know, Politicians are infamous for creating grandiose stories of what the future might behold, or scientists from the major research institutes talking about what the future. But human nature says, okay, I'm starting here at point A, you're painting a story out at point B. Is it plausible? Can I see myself going from today to the future, and can I see a pathway to connect that? Is it plausible for that future to become reality? Second is coherence. Coherence in the context of everything else that's going around in the technology world or in the marketplace that you're conceiving this story around. Does it hang together from the standpoint of everything else that's going on, other research areas, whatever the case might be? And third is around what I would call reasonableness. Now, reasonableness is I can see myself making jumps. Can I see those jumps being done in a reasonable amount of increments or a reasonable amount of activities, and therefore the timeline makes sense? Am I going to be able to have faster than light travel and be able to go back in time via time machine and do that in 5 years? Probably. You may think that that's plausible, but is it reasonable? Can I make those kinds of connections in that kind of a time frame? And basically, the construct of putting a story that's both plausible, it has coherence, and it's also reasonable is that it enables people to make sense of the complex changes. And let's face it, when you're thinking about killer innovations or killer breakthroughs, this is going to inject complex changes into your organizational culture, into the marketplace, into economies, into entire governments, and potentially on a worldwide basis. And so therefore, when you're asking people to make sense of those kinds of complex changes, you need to almost lay down those breadcrumbs. Is it plausible? Is it coherent? And does it have it? And is it reasonable? And really, the whole purpose of putting together a story to share or sell your idea is it has to generate in the listener's mind, what I would call almost a fresh view of the idea. Meaning, if it comes across and sounds like, this used to be black and now it's blue, very hard to ignite the passion. So you have to have a basic construct around the idea that presents it as being fresh and new. Second is it also has to be in big picture. We tend to, for those of us who, focus in the space of being innovative and creative and have job tasks that look for us to create, the next products for our companies. The problem we have is we tend to get down into the details way too fast. When you're out there and you're constructing the story, it's not to get into the technical details, but it is to deliver the big picture. It needs to be able to stay at the right level. So irrespective of the audience, whether that audience is deeply technical or whether that audience is, is a management team or whatever the case might be, it is how do you construct the story such that it has the right big picture, and so therefore can deliver that right that context and then that right perspective. And then third is it needs to be self-generating, meaning it has to be able to perceive the user themselves into that story. They need to be able to say, okay, I understand the concept of this idea, this concept. I see it in the context of the big picture, and I can place myself into that story. I can see how it's going to impact me. I can see how it's going to help me. I can see how it's going to help my family, or it's going to help my business, or it's going to help the industry, or it's going to help solve a world need. Whatever the context may be, it needs to be what we would call self-generating, meaning I can adopt this story, I can adopt this idea and place myself into that story, and therefore literally generate the what's next with regards to that story and let it be self-generating. So, how do you construct one of these kinds of stories? Well, there's basically three components or three things that really need to be in what I would call a real killer story that really can ignite the passion of your audience. One is, as I would call, connectedness. This links the audience with the positive idea. You need to have the construct of the idea, along with a protagonist with whom the audience can empathize. It needs to have something or somebody or an organization in context to your idea that the audience can empathize with. And that's important because that's what drives then their ability to take that organization out, place themselves into that story, take that individual out, place their family into that story. You need to be able to connect your idea to organizations, individuals, whatever the right context is for the idea that you're generating. Next for the story is and this is kind of a strange one, is that it needs to be strange. You need to have some kind of unique twist to the story that has to violate the listener's expectations. We all kind of, we listen to, point A, point B, and our minds are already jumping to point C, what the conclusion is. Whether it's in a PowerPoint presentation in the conference room, we've all gotten to slide 5 or slide 6, and we're already trying to figure out what the last 2 slides are going to say is the conclusion. So in order for the story to have the right hook, it needs to violate listeners' expectations. You need to have something unique in the story that's going to cause them to kind of step back and really snap to attention about what it is you're saying. And then third is it needs to be able to be comprehended by a wide range of listeners. It needs to embody the idea so the listeners get elevated to the new level of understanding. If you're just repeating what everybody knows and it's the same context of an idea that everybody knows, you're not going to ignite the passion. You're not going to ignite the listener to your story to want to get behind you and support you in the process of selling or generating the idea. So again, constructing the story, it needs to have some kind of connection or connectedness between the idea and some kind of a protagonist that the audience can empathize with. 2, it needs to have some kind of what I would call strangeness. It needs to have something unique. It must violate the listener's expectations in some way. And third, I need to be able to comprehend it. I need to be able to have it such that the idea transfers the listener from what they know now to a new level of understanding, and so therefore they can see the possibilities and the value of the idea. And in creating these stories, if they're done well, if you construct them well, the listener's minds will race ahead. They'll take that raw idea, that story, and that context that you've delivered it in, and they'll place themselves in it. They'll be able to see where your idea is today and all of the possibilities in the future that idea or that innovation that you're working on is going to have as far as a possibility. Secondly, if the story's done well, the listeners are going to imagine the future implications. They're going to see where they fit in. They're going to see opportunities. They're going to see holes. They're going to see where what you're working on and somebody else that they know is working on another part, where those two might come together and create an entirely third opportunity. So they can imagine the future implications. And then lastly, if the story is done well, the listeners will elaborate on your ideas and into other contexts for their own business, for their families, for their communities, for social causes that they're interested in. And again, the purpose of telling the stories is to ignite the passion of your listeners to, one, support you in the commercialization or in getting support for your ideas or for your innovations. And 2 is to elicit that audience to really become the catalyst to take your ideas forward and bring those into the marketplace. And with that, hopefully that was helpful from the standpoint. In a future podcast, I'm going to expand more on storytelling and share with you some stories that I've constructed over the years when trying to sell or convince management around certain ideas or innovations that I've been working on. So that we will hold that off for some future podcasts. Also, in the show notes, I will post up a link for you to get and locate Stephen Denning's book called The Springboard. It's published by a small publishing house called Butterworth Heinemann. But again, I will post that up on the show notes, so if you're interested in getting a copy of The Springboard. Again, this is primarily around how to use stories from a knowledge management perspective. But when I read the book, I saw the immediate value and have used many of the tricks that Stephen has identified in his book in order to tell stories and convince audiences or convince management team around the value and potential for ideas and innovations that I've been working on. Okay, segment 2, weak signals. I don't know about you, but I've been reading a lot of the press lately talking about some of the challenges for older generation, both in society. If you look at the average age of the population, getting much longer, and so therefore, we're getting into kind of this, baby boom bubble here in the U.S. and in other countries as well, where the average population of people over the age of 60 is growing at a pretty phenomenal rate. Now, in the work world, we have challenges, obviously, with older employees from the standpoint that many businesses discount the value of those older workers from the standpoint of being able to react quickly, learn new technologies, adapt to changing processes, support organizational changes, etc. And many organizations either have forced retirement at a certain age or don't provide quite as much support around aging populations. And one of the areas in weak signals, when looking for new kinds of ideas and new kinds of innovations, one area that I think is a significantly untapped resource are this older generation. These people who bring forward a lot of experience, a lot of depth, a lot of perspective. I mean, it's kind of the analogy that I would use, when our teenagers are getting into the early teenage years and they kind of think that their parents don't know anything and they've got it all figured out and they just kind of ignore the older generation. And then all of a sudden when they either are in college or just graduating from college or just starting their own families, it's amazing. Parents all of a sudden become brilliant and the kids realize that the parents aren't so dumb anymore. I think we kind of go through kind of a similar wave when our own parents maybe get older in years and we kind of discount them. They've been retired for so long, they're out of the work world, they don't understand, or they just don't understand the new technologies. They don't understand certain things that are happening in the economy, whatever the case might be. And personally, I think that is just a huge missed opportunity from the standpoint of leveraging that older generation to identify weak signals and new market opportunities. Plus, that is also one of the fastest growing markets. That population over the age of 55 is one of the fastest growing populations that we have, given that we're not back into any kind of a birth boom. So, children, teenagers, as such, are continuing at a fairly normal curve, but that population over 55 is growing at a phenomenal rate. So what value can you get from this gray hair population as far as source of new ideas and new innovations? Well, one is that when you look at this older generation, there's basically two kinds of innovations from the standpoint that we normally operate in. One is what we call conceptual innovators. And these are like typically coming from the younger generation. These are people who tend to focus on, what is the possible out there. Older generation is what we would call experimental innovators. So this is people who are drawing on their lifetime of observations of trial and error. So again, conceptual innovators tend to be the younger generation. Experimental innovators, leveraging their experience, leveraging their knowledge to be able to apply that experience and be able to do these kinds of experimental innovators. So depending on what your needs are, and we've talked in previous podcasts, particularly when I did the interview with the management team at Brain Reactions, and their focus was heavily on using students in the university setting. There may be an opportunity to create almost kind of a Brain Reactions type of organization, but focused on these kinds of experimental innovations, leveraging the perspectives of an older generation. So something to keep in mind. Also, the other context from the standpoint of this older generation are their problem-solving skills. They've got 30, 40, 50 years of experience in solving a whole wide range of problems, whether that be their own personal, in their business career, whatever the case might be. And they've really got, what I would call the equivalent of a PhD at solving what I would call ill-defined problems. They've lasted this long. They've been successful to this point in their lives and in their careers and their families, having to solve literally day-to-day problems. And that's a huge amount of experience and expertise when trying to develop or create radically new ideas and radically new innovations, and bringing that diversity into your process as far as creating those kinds of ideas. And last and not least, one of the areas of leveraging the older generation is around compensation. There are entire organizations of retired advertising executives and retired consultants that basically donate their time for new and innovative startups. So it isn't always an issue of typically the age discrimination topic, which is, I'll get rid of an older generation person and hire a younger person because I can get them at a cheaper rate. There's many organizations that leverage that expertise of an older generation to the benefit of young, new, creative kinds of startups. At the same time, you're also paying and leveraging that kind of unique expertise that's been built up over 30 or 40 or 50 years. So again, with regards to the weak signals, there's a huge market opportunity, fastest growing segment, 55 years and over. There's a huge amount of innovative skills and expertise and problem-solving expertise that's in that generation. We've learned in previous Killer Innovations podcasts of the value of diversity of opinion and diversity of perspectives, and bringing that older generation into that pool can really unlock and create some weak signals that I think would be very hard for us in the typical age brackets that we see in the innovation teams at organizations. That would just be an oversight. So being able to bring that diversity and that perspective in can unlock huge potentials with regards to the weak signals. And with that, we'll move on to segment 3, the killer question of the week. This week's killer question actually plays off of one that we had, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. So this week's killer question is could I offer my product at 5 times the cost if it had greater feature and function? And what would be the features and functions that would allow you to charge that kind of price? Could I offer my product or service at 5 times the cost if it had greater feature or function? And what would be the feature or functions that would allow you to charge 5 times as much? So this is somewhat similar to the question or the killer question of the week that discussed increasing distribution costs. And we talked about brand name stores that are in prime retail locations, significant cost of sales increase, distribution costs to get the product into the customer from a selling perspective. And to talk about if you significantly increase your distribution cost, you potentially can change the brand perception in your customers' minds, meaning customers who are looking for high brand um, uh, can translate that I go to Fifth Avenue in New York to buy that product, and so therefore, just by the fact that the store is on Fifth Avenue and is in a very high price area and has a certain kind of store design, translates into brand image and potential value of that product. But in this case, we're talking about true feature function. This is not about bling, so this isn't about looks and colors and how many diamonds are encrusted on the outside of my iPod. It is not about bling. This is about features and functions. What is it you can do in your feature function of your product that you could charge 5 times what you charge today? Now, many times people say, well, I don't know what that would be. Well, this is the stretch exercise. What is it that you could add to your product that the marketplace would pay 5 times more? Now, the example in this would be FedEx. Think about it. Before FedEx arrived, 32 cents for an envelope, and that was just kind of the normal way when I wanted to send a letter, slap a stamp on it, drop it in the mailbox. FedEx steps in and delivers feature function, meaning I now get that envelope or letter there rather than taking 3 to 4 or 5 days to go coast to coast. I can have it there the next day, and I'll charge you 10 times, 20 times more than what it cost before. But there was a feature function that allowed for a significant increase, up to 5 times that cost. So again, could I offer my product at 5 times the cost if it had greater feature function? And what would those feature functions be in order to achieve that 5x cost savings? And in this example, it's FedEx. So again, we're going to wrap up the show because we're actually running a little bit over 30 minutes. Thank you for listening. Please continue to provide the feedback. You can drop me an email at podcast@killerinnovations.com. You can also dial the feedback line, 703-636-4460. And also you can Skype me. My Skype address is Phil_McKinney. Now, this is the 1st of July, or the first show in July. So for those of you who've been around for a while know that Podcast Alley, which is the major site for all podcasters that rank shows based on votes from their listeners, they reset those counters back to 0 at the first of the month. So going out to Podcast Alley and voting for your favorite podcast, again, is the way to tell the companies that produce, or the individuals that produce your favorite podcasts, that you appreciate the effort, the time, and the resources they put into it. So go out to Podcast Alley. Again, it's the first of the month, so all your previous votes have been set back to 0. So go out to Podcast Alley and just vote for your favorite podcast. Communicate back to the producers of your favorite podcast that you really do appreciate the amount of time and the amount of effort and resources that it takes to put out the material. Also, as I said before, Killer Innovations is now up on the iTunes store, so you can find it there. If you download the new iTunes 4.9, you can subscribe to all of your podcasts now directly within iTunes, and therefore leverage iTunes to even new capabilities and new functions and features. And also, don't forget, provide me feedback on the new tags, ID3 tags. This is the information about the show that's embedded in the MP3 file. So how does it look on your display? Any issues, questions, problems that it's causing you? I'm only going to apply this to this show based on feedback. Then I will go back and apply the new ID3 tags to all of the previous shows. So again, I know this show's gone a few minutes long. We're coming up on 35 minutes, but a lot of information to share. And thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.